Hello everyone, I'm Marshall Garvey with Empower the Vote, and welcome back to our video series. Today I want to talk about history repeating itself in a very specific way. Time and again, there is that paranoid refrain that creeps up in impassioned political discourse. Fascism is rising again. At its most uninformed and childish, critics of an unpopular president or politician will inevitably conjure imagery of them with a Hitler mustache and uniform. The late 2010s and the dawn of the 2020s, however, has vindicated fears of resurgent fascism with relentless shock and trauma. In August 2017, neo-Nazis and Klansmen descended on Charlottesville, Virginia, attacking counter-protesters and killing Heather Heyer. White supremacists are running for office in record numbers. Police and vigilante violence towards African Americans and racial justice protesters has been especially deadly this year. Across the globe, far-right leaders reign supreme, from Vladimir Putin to Shinzo Abe to Viktor Orban. Their power is only exacerbated by the crises of capitalism and economic inequality resultant of the 2008 economic recession. The latest recession of 2020, caused by the coronavirus pandemic, has provided a new, hostile backdrop for right-wing extremists and conspiracy theorists to gain traction. In almost every manner conceivable, we are living in a revival of the 1930s. Back then, the economy that had soared during the Roaring '20s crashed, consigning the US and other nations to the Great Depression. The original fascist dictators terrorized the globe, among them Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, and Francisco Franco. Support for fascism was not limited to the European continent. Here in the United States, many Nazi sympathizers organized the German-American Bund, which grew in large enough numbers to host a rally at Madison Square Garden in 1939. Some critics of the U.S. entering World War II used the now all-too-familiar refrain of America First. The violence of Jim Crow in the United States continued, with lynchings and arguably the first modern race riot in Harlem in 1935. While white women had attained the right to vote in 1920, there were still barriers to democracy for African Americans, Native Americans, and Asian Americans. Through the muck and bile of economic desperation, democratic intransigence, racist violence, and a march to a Second World War, a new medium entered households that provided unprecedented escapism, as well as political engagement and hope: radio. In 1933 alone, the year Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the office of President of the United States, 3.6 million radio sets were sold across the country. The power of radio to galvanize and aid the masses was quickly seized upon by the federal government. As part of Roosevelt's ambitious swath of New Deal programs, the Federal Theater Project put unemployed artists to work with skits that promoted history and democracy. The most famous example, of course, came in the form of the president's fireside chats, in which he addressed citizens directly in their living rooms regarding important issues. However, the millions of transistors in households from California to New York weren't exclusively the province of goodwill and hope. One of the most popular speakers of the 30s was Father Charles Coughlin, a Detroit-based Catholic priest who blamed Jewish bankers for the country's economic ills. Far from the ramblings of an obscure lunatic, he entertained an estimated 30 million listeners each week. Radio was also a pivotal tool in aiding fascist seizure of power in Europe, as well as spreading their message beyond national borders. One can see a mirror image in the rapid evolution of the internet and social media and politics since 2008 in particular. On the upside, the web has created dynamic avenues to spread awareness of causes and protests, as evidenced by Occupy Wall Street and more recently, and more massively, Black Lives Matter. However, like Father Coughlin and others who hijacked the burgeoning airwaves over 80 years ago, there is similarly an anti-democratic dark side to the instant information and mobilization of the World Wide Web. White nationalists operate on Facebook despite the company's stated ban on offending accounts. The alt-right entered the political mainstream with their savvy use of the internet, primarily memes. Inexplicably, Facebook and Twitter only recently committed to banning Holocaust denial on their platforms. More recently, conspiracy theories, once believed only to reside at the margins of society, have now taken hold thanks to online platforms. Several years after the Pizzagate allegations on Reddit culminated in an armed attack on a pizza parlor, the paranoid ramblings of QAnon have gained traction thanks to the isolation of the pandemic. There are many lessons to procure from comparing this current time to the 1930s. One being that, while it's easy to be overwhelmed by technology, it's nonetheless important to be judicious in evaluating the truth of what it conveys. There is also the need for the government to utilize communications in a way that's not only ethical, but conducive to improving the general welfare of the public at large. Whatever the solutions, we have a level of communicative and mobilizing power with the internet that is simply unmatched in history. Just as we're seeing some of its worst elements at play in this election, We are also seeing its democratic advantages as awareness of injustice and the importance of civic participation grows. Even after the ballots are counted this November, let's make sure the internet continues to be a platform of enlightenment and plurality, rather than mendacity and hate. Thank you everyone for joining me. I'm Marshall Garvey with Empower the Vote and History Specialists, and I'll see you next time.